Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zickery of Space Command. And I'm going to be posting a fair number of videos over the next few days, trying to play catch up. But one thing I wanted to do was start talking about a number of shows I'm watching that I find of very high quality that are all, interestingly enough, taking place in parallel dimensions on alternate Earths, or Earth with an alternate history. Now, some of you know that I was a writer-producer on Sliders, some of you don't, but I wrote a number of scripts for Sliders, and I loved writing about parallel universes and alternative timelines, and so this is naturally something that I gravitate toward. So the three shows that are, interestingly enough, on the air at the same time, taking place in alternate timelines, are Man in the High Castle, Watchmen, and His Dark Materials, which is also known as the Golden Compass. Now, of those, all of them are based on pre-existing material. Two of them on novels, and Watchmen basically on a graphic novel that's been very famous. But let's start talking. I'm going to start talking about Man in the High Castle. Now here, this is the first edition, and it won the Hugo Award in the early 60s. It was written by, can you see that? Philip K. Dick, who here is a young man. And that's really cool because he was, you normally know him as sort of a middle-aged, bearded guy who's kind of, got a pot belly. And I love seeing him when he was like a young, brilliant man and had the world before him, life before him. So this time I'm just going to talk about Man in the High Castle. Then I will be talking about these other shows very soon. But Man in the High Castle was created, developed for TV by my friend Frank Spotnitz, who comes off of X-Files and subsequently to Medici and many other shows. Brilliant guy, great writer. And the challenge with Man in the High Castle, it takes place in an alternate history in the early 60s where the Nazis and the Japanese won World War II. And it's fascinating. Now, this is actually a subgenre of science fiction that I've always loved. And there are a number of books that take place in alternate histories where the Nazis won. There's a book called Fatherland, which I highly recommend, by Robert Harris. There's also SSGB, and by Len Dighton, many others. And they're usually a lot of fun, because the Nazis were trying to build an empire. They were terrible, they were evil, they were stylish, and of course Hitler killed that style of mustache forever. So here we go. So Man in the High Castle, it came out, as I said, in the early 60s, and it took place in the continental United States. Japan has the western states. The middle states are kind of a free area or a no man's land, and then the East Coast is the Nazis run it. And it's a wonderful book. Yeah, I urge you to read it or listen to it on audio. But then Philip K. Dick started working on a sequel, because the Man in the High Castle basically features primarily the Japanese side of things and the Americans who are struggling to live under Japanese occupation. He started a sequel which would have taken place, which would have focused much more on the Germans, but he only got a short way into it, and then it was just too depressing. He didn't want to live in that headset any longer. And fortunately, that basic beginning of the novel has been published, and it's great. It's just great. There was one edition of Man in the High Castle that included that fragment and of the sequel. And if you can find that, do so. It's also in some of his collections of fiction. I recommend it. It's really well written and really interesting. And I'm sorry that he didn't write that novel, but the beginning is great. So Frank Spotnitz took these elements and wove them together into an extremely good show. And they've just completed the series, 4 seasons and out. And it's available on Amazon Prime. You can also find it, you can buy it on Blu-ray and so forth. And but it's just great. It's just great. And it has a wonderful cast headed up by Rufus Sewell. Now, if you don't know Rufus Sewell, he starred in Dark City, which is a great science fiction movie. Never watch the theatrical version. Always watch the director's cut. They're two completely different movies, but the director's cut is fabulous, and he's great in it. And he's also in a very fun movie called Cold Comfort Farm that I recommend. And but he's just a very solid actor, and his career went a little bit into decline, but he's certainly come back strong with Man in the High Castle. He plays John Smith, an American who becomes a Nazi and rises in the hierarchy. He's terrific. He's just terrific, and the whole cast is great. And we also have characters who are Japanese. We have characters who are German. It deals with Hitler, it deals with Himmler. Another thing that Frank did that was very smart was in the book. There's sort of this forbidden book called "The Man in the High Castle," which no, it's not called "The Man in the High Castle." The author is called "The Man in the High Castle," but it's a book that he's written that shows an alternate history where the Allies won. And in the TV show, those are films that are covertly released that show an alternate history where the Allies won. It shows a variety of alternate histories, and and that was good to make it visual rather than just something you read. But the show has an amazing scope. It shows you Berlin as the Hitler. Hitler had a whole plan with Albert Speer, his great architect. He because Hitler, something that's not talked about very often is Hitler was an artist before he was a dictator. He had actually wanted a career in fine art. His artwork isn't bad. It's not great, but definitely he had training, and he sold little postcards on the basically a street artist, and he was a failed artist, and so he became he went into politics, and but he had a very strong visual sense, and it was so particularly with his architecture, he came up with a very striking architecture, and he was also overseeing the uniforms that Hugo Boss designed for the Nazis and all of that. But with with Albert Speer, he planned an entire new city that would have been when the Thousand Year Reich. It would have been the center of the Thousand Year Reich, and there were models of this city that included this vast domed building that would have held thousands and thousands of people, and so they recreated that in CG in Man in the High Castle, and they show how all these different characters would interact, particularly as they become aware that there are alternate dimensions with different histories, and they get to see alternate versions of themselves. And and it's fascinating because shows either end just suddenly without a culmination, or they have a deliberate ending point. Now, some shows are designed where they don't know where they're going. Other shows are designed where they do. And generally, when they do know where they're going, it helps things significantly because you can lay that out. And one of the first science fiction TV shows that did that, of course, was Babylon 5, on which I was a writer. And it's always a very good idea, but because they're not frumphing around and wandering, and also this requires that you have someone in charge who knows what they're doing, and a writing staff that's working simpatico with each other rather than in opposition to each other. So with Man in the High Castle, they they wrapped it up. They have an ending. Now, of course, I was very nervous about what that ending might be because, in my opinion, Game of Thrones just totally dropped the ball at the end. It was a terrible ending. You felt that everyone was already on to their next project and was no longer connected emotionally to the show, and they just kind of wrote something that was very left-hand writing, very poorly conceived, and just you wish they would just have gone back and redone it and not screwed over their own show, because when a show has a bad ending, it really wrecks you regarding that show. For instance, I have no interest in watching Game of Thrones ever again because the ending was so poor. And if they were smart, they'd do kind of an extra movie that would at least wrap things up better and pay decent respect to the characters. But they're not going to do that, I don't think. So, but again, endings are very important. And so with Man of the High Castle, they did a very good job. It wasn't perfect, but they basically thought about where these characters would go to and what they would be like and what they might do and who might survive and who wouldn't. And I'm not going to give spoilers here. I don't want to, but the way the characters twist and turn and interact with each other, and those relationships change and they deepen it. One of the things that's great is they look at the characters creating atrocities, and they're not just stock villains. They really kind of go into the headset of why people do these terrible things, and what they think about it, what they feel about it, if they feel anything at all. Um, and it was particularly with Rufus Sewell's character, where you get to see a version of him where America won the war, and he's a very different man. And wonderfully enough, they get to have him say he has an awareness of what he would have been had he gone down a different road. And it's great that they give him that speech, because he has self-awareness, and that has a ripple effect, and that has ramifications with the other version of him, our main character in the Nazi world, who has basically, to save himself and his family, has made choices that have essentially cost him his soul, more or less. And the question really is, will he pull back from that? Will he change based on what he now knows? and the other characters, and several things they do that are fascinating. They really play with the alternate history in fascinating ways. For instance, in our world, in our timeline, or what's closer to our timeline, where the Allies won, they show the civil rights movement, where African Americans are trying to have sit-ins at counters, lunch counters, and so forth, to try to get their rights. But in the world where the Nazis and the Japanese won, there's no civil rights movement. Black people are second-class citizens, but so are Americans, and so essentially, what you get rather than a civil rights movement is a black liberation movement, a guerrilla army that are staging acts of sabotage and terrorism. And that's fascinating. And they want an all black homeland. And ultimately, what happens with that is they get more than they bargained for, but it leads to a very interesting place. But that's a fascinating turn that I wouldn't have thought of. I think they've really looked at our world in the '60s and extrapolated where a different history would have taken us. So basically, I would highly recommend Man in the High Castle. If you haven't watched it, it's well worth your time and effort. The production value is great. The scope of it is great. The acting is uniformly strong, and I'll be very interested to see where these talented writers go from here, because they're going to scatter to the winds. When a show ends, the writer producers scatter to the winds, and they often create further great shows. But I'm so glad that Frank was the guy they hired to adapt this TV. It was very daunting, and he hugely pulled it off. He did a fabulous job, and it's a great show. And I will say that to him next time I talk to him. But that's it for now. So next time we'll be talking about Watchmen, and then after that we'll be talking about His Dark Materials / The Golden Compass. We'll also be catching up with our history of science fiction films, then our history of science fiction television. We're about to ramp up big time for Space Command this month. Or I guess next month we'll be recording the audio play. We're working on the graphic novel. The novel is finished. We're almost done with the hour, and we're going to ship that. We're going to be having a webisodes that we'll be posting almost immediately. We're building a futuristic car. We're building an alien spaceship. We're building creatures. It's an amazing life, an amazing world. Many of you know I just wrote a pilot for CW. We're waiting to hear on that. And additionally, I'm creating Sweet Haven with Rockne O'Bannon, who's the executive producer of Evil, and he's also the creator of Farscape, Defiance, Alien Nation, Sequest. And I'm creating shows with other like-minded souls as well. And so it's a pretty amazing life. If you want to buy Space Command shares, you can check that out below. We have a GoFundMe campaign. You can throw some dollars our way. It really is appreciated. It goes to Space Command, and we have a Patreon account. So all of those things help. If you like what we're doing, supporting it with a few bucks is the way to keep us on track and moving forward. So thanks very much, and we'll talk to you very soon. Bye, guys.